after an auto mechanic was slapped with a ruinous defamation lawsuit for a negative online review of a national car repair chain whose PAC is a major donor to Senator Tom Cotton, Representative Jasmine Crockett used a press conference on the Capitol steps to turn a local dispute into a national referendum on corporate bullying. The moment the clip hit the internet, it detonated. News alerts flashed across millions of phone screens with the same core message. A Democratic congresswoman from Texas was publicly accusing a sitting Republican senator of enabling a corporate campaign to crush a working man. Within the hour, #StandWithFrank was trending above celebrity gossip and the day's other political squabbles. Cable news producers scrambled to tear up their planned segments, booking legal analysts and political strategists to dissect Crockett's audacious move. The corporation, Apex Auto Centers, saw its mentions on social media turn into a raging torrent of one-star reviews and boycotts. In Washington, D.C., and in Bentonville, Arkansas, phones inside the offices of Senator Tom Cotton and Apex Auto's CEO began ringing with a ferocity that signaled a Category 5 political hurricane had just made landfall. 48 hours earlier, the storm was just a low-pressure system in a small corner of the internet, visible only to those who knew where to look. Frank Miller, age 58, sat at his worn kitchen table in a suburb of Little Rock, Arkansas, staring at a thick manila envelope for the 10th time. It felt heavier than a lawsuit. It felt like an anchor. Inside, dense paragraphs of legalese accused him of malicious defamation, tortious interference, and infliction of emotional distress upon a corporate entity. The entity was Apex Auto Centers, a coast-to-coast chain of repair shops with gleaming lobbies and a marketing budget larger than the entire municipal budget of Frankstown. The source of their distress? A 142-word review Frank had posted on a local business aggregator site 2 weeks prior. He'd taken his wife's 2018 SUV to the local Apex for a simple transmission fluid change. They'd kept it for 2 days, charged him nearly triple the initial quote, and returned it with a new, grinding sound in second gear. The manager had smirked when he complained, pointing to the fine print on the work order he'd signed. So Frank, who had run his own single-bay garage for 30 years before a bad back forced him into early retirement, went home and did the only thing he could. He warned others. He wrote calmly and precisely, detailing the upcharges, the new noise, and the manager's dismissive attitude. He ended it with a simple line. "A lifetime of working on cars taught me to be honest with people about their vehicles. I can't say I saw that same honesty at Apex." The lawsuit demanded $150,000 in damages and a public, notarized apology. It was a death sentence for his finances and his pride. He'd called 3 local lawyers. The first 2 laughed. The third gave him a sliver of sympathy but quoted a retainer fee that might as well have been $1 million. Frank was invisible, a ghost in his own life, haunted by a corporation with limitless resources. His wife, Mary, found him rubbing his temples, the lawsuit sitting next to a cold cup of coffee. "There's nothing we can do," he'd said, the words tasting like ash. "They're too big." In a different part of the country, Jasmine Crockett's D.C. office was humming with the controlled chaos of a congressional workweek. Her chief of staff, a sharp, perpetually caffeinated woman named Dara, was scrolling through a media monitoring service that flagged mentions of lawmakers alongside trending topics. A small but growing thread on a legal advice subreddit caught her eye. The title was, "Sued for $150,000 for a negative review in Arkansas." It was Frank's story. What made Dara pause was a comment deep in the thread from a user who had done some digging. "Get this," the user wrote. "Apex Auto's corporate PAC, Apex Forward, gave the maximum donation to Senator Tom Cotton's re-election campaign last cycle. They're headquartered in his state." Dara's political instincts fired. It wasn't just a corporate bully story anymore. It was a David and Goliath story with a political leviathan lurking in the background. She brought it to Crockett late that evening, expecting the congresswoman to be exhausted after a grueling 15-hour day of hearings and constituent calls. She found her at her desk, poring over a dense agricultural appropriations bill. Crockett listened intently as Dara laid out the details of Frank Miller's predicament, her expression shifting from tired focus to a familiar, steely concentration. It was the look Dara had come to recognize from Crockett's days as a public defender. The look she got when she saw an institutional power imbalance about to crush an individual. "They're not trying to win a case," Crockett said, her voice low and even. "They're making an example of him. It's a strategic lawsuit against public participation, a SLAPP suit. It's designed to bleed him dry and scare anyone else from speaking up." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the Capitol dome, visible and illuminated through her office window. The fight was in Arkansas, not her district in Texas. The antagonist was a U.S. senator, not some state-level official. Getting involved was politically risky, a potential overreach that could bring down the full fury of the Republican establishment. Dara could see the calculations happening behind her boss's eyes. Then Crockett spoke again. "Get me this man's phone number, Frank Miller. I don't care how you do it. Find him." At the same time, Senator Tom Cotton was enjoying a steak dinner at the Capitol Grizel with a senior vice president from Apex Auto's parent company. The conversation was comfortable, a seamless blend of policy talk and confident assurances. The executive mentioned, almost as an aside, a minor nuisance they were cleaning up. A disgruntled customer who'd posted a libelous review and was now being dealt with through the proper legal channels. Cotton nodded, his expression unchanging. He saw the world in clear, stark terms. There were builders and there were critics. Corporations like Apex were builders. They created jobs, generated tax revenue, and supported the politicians who understood the value of a pro-business environment. Critics, whether in the press or on a review website, were a friction cost, a nuisance to be managed efficiently. "You have to protect your brand," Cotton said, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. "It's your most valuable asset. Permitting baseless attacks to go unanswered projects weakness." The executive smiled, relieved. "That's exactly our position, Senator. We're simply holding him accountable." Cotton gave a slight, affirmative nod. The issue was, in his mind, already resolved, his private matter. A simple function of the legal system operating as intended to protect the free market. The idea that this microscopic event could ever reach his orbit, let alone become a political liability, was as remote and ludicrous as a meteor striking their table. His world was one of power, of policy, of nations and ideologies. A mechanic in Little Rock didn't even register as a data point. The overconfidence was absolute, baked into the very foundation of his political worldview. He was a senator of the United States. He dealt with threats from Tehran and Beijing, not from some guy with greasy fingernails and a grudge. The call from Washington, D.C. came as a shock. Frank Miller nearly dropped the phone when the voice on the other end said she was calling from the office of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. His first thought was that it was a prank. But the woman, Dara, was persistent and professional. She explained that the Congresswoman had read about his situation and wanted to help. An hour later, Frank was on a video call with Crockett herself. He was a man drowning, and a hand had just reached down through the churning water. He was nervous, stammering at first, but Crockett's demeanor put him at ease. She didn't talk like a politician. She talked like a lawyer, her questions sharp, precise, and empathetic. She asked about his back, his old garage, his wife. She made him walk her through the entire incident with Apex, from the moment he dropped the car off to the moment he was served with the papers. He explained his fear, his helplessness. "Mr. Miller," Crockett said, her face clear and determined on his laptop screen, "what Apex Auto is doing to you is not just wrong, it's a perversion of the justice system. They know you can't afford to fight, and they're counting on that. We can't let them get away with it." She laid out a plan. It was bold, aggressive, and frankly, terrifying. A press conference. On the steps of the U.S. Capitol, they would fly him and Mary to D.C. He would stand with her as she took his case public. "They want to make an example of you, Frank," she explained. "So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make them an example of what happens when corporate power tries to silence an American citizen." For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope ignited in Frank's chest. It was a dangerous hope, one that could easily be extinguished, but it was there. He looked at Mary, who was listening just off camera, her eyes wide. She gave him a slow, firm nod. He turned back to the screen. "Okay," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Okay, Congresswoman, I'll do it." The morning of the press conference was a blur of motion. Frank and Mary were ushered through the Rayburn House office building by Crockett's staff, the scale of the place making Frank feel smaller than ever. He wore his best suit, a navy one he'd bought for a nephew's wedding 5 years ago. It felt stiff and unfamiliar. Jasmine Crockett met them in her office. In person, she was even more formidable, radiating an energy that filled the room. She shook Frank's hand firmly. "Frank, thank you for being here. You're doing a brave thing. All you have to do today is stand there. I'll do the talking. But if a reporter asks you a question, just speak from the heart. Tell them what you told me." She handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of the statement Senator Cotton's office had released to the press an hour earlier. A reporter had forwarded it to her. Frank read it, his hands trembling slightly. "A disgruntled customer with a personal vendetta." The words stung, a public branding that felt more painful than the lawsuit itself. He looked up at Crockett, his eyes filled with a fresh wave of despair. "He's calling me a liar," Frank whispered. Crockett placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "He's making a mistake." They walked out onto the plaza in front of the Capitol. The famous dome loomed behind them, a symbol of the power now arrayed against him. A cluster of cameras and microphones was waiting, a mechanical beast of lenses and wires. Reporters shouted questions as Crockett led Frank to the lectern. The air was cool, but sweat trickled down Frank's back. Crockett tapped the microphone, and a hush fell over the small crowd of journalists. Her face was set, a mask of righteous anger. "Good morning," she began, her voice crisp and carrying in the open air. "We are here today because the promise of free speech is not reserved for the powerful, the wealthy, or the well-connected. It is the sacred birthright of every single American, including Mr. Frank Miller, who stands beside me today." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the reporters. "Mr. Miller is a retired auto mechanic. For 30 years he made an honest living with his hands, and when he received dishonest service from a national corporation called Apex Auto Centers, he used his voice to do what any of us would do. He wrote a negative online review to warn his neighbors." She held up a single sheet of paper. "This is his review. It is 142 words long." Then, she held up the thick sheaf of legal documents that had terrorized Frank for weeks. "And this is the $150,000 federal lawsuit Apex Auto filed against him to silence him. This is not justice. This is a corporate bludgeon. It is a SLAPP suit, designed to intimidate and bankrupt a private citizen for the crime of having an opinion." A reporter from a major news network raised his hand. "Congresswoman, Senator Tom Cotton's office released a statement saying your client is a disgruntled customer with a personal vendetta, and that Apex Auto has a right to defend its brand from baseless online attacks. How do you respond to the senator, who represents Mr. Miller's home state?" The question hung in the air, the moment of direct confrontation. This was the pivot. Crockett's expression sharpened. She had been waiting for this. She didn't just look at the reporter. She looked through him, at the cameras, broadcasting her response live across the nation. "I'm glad you brought up the senator," she said, her tone dripping with controlled fire. She turned and gestured toward Frank, a man who looked utterly out of place, a piece of everyday life dropped into the heart of American power. "Does this man look like a threat to you? Does he look like the mastermind of a corporate sabotage campaign?" She turned back to the cameras, her voice rising with indignation. She held up the lawsuit again, shaking it slightly for emphasis. "This isn't a defense of a brand. It's an attack on a citizen. Mr. Miller fixed cars for 30 years with his hands. He left a 2-paragraph review with his thumbs. The idea that he is a threat to a billion-dollar company is absurd." She took a step closer to the microphone, her eyes blazing. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind, the line she knew would define the fight. Senator Cotton says this is about a personal vendetta. He's right." She paused, letting the admission land with a thud. The vendetta is from a corporate bully against a working man who dared to tell the truth, a corporate bully whose PAC just happens to be a major donor to the senator's campaigns. They're not just trying to silence Frank, they're trying to silence all of you. They want a country where if you speak truth to power, that power has the right to reach into your home, into your bank account, and ruin your life. She gestured to the Capitol dome behind her. That is not what this building stands for. That is not what our Constitution protects, and as long as I have a voice, I will not let it happen. The silence that followed was broken only by the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Crockett had just drawn a direct line between a senator, his corporate donor, and an attack on the First Amendment. She had taken Frank Miller's small, private battle and placed it squarely in the center of the national stage. Another reporter shouted a question, this one directed at Frank. "Mr. Miller, what do you have to say to Apex Auto and Senator Cotton?" Frank flinched, startled by the sudden attention. All eyes were on him. He gripped the sides of the lectern, his knuckles white. He hadn't prepared a statement. Crockett had told him he didn't need one. He just needed to be himself. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and leaned into the microphone. His voice, when it came out, was not the voice of a political player, but of a grandfather, a neighbor, a mechanic. I'm not a disgruntled customer," he said, his voice quiet but steady. I'm a customer, that's all. I thought people should know what happened to me. That's it. I didn't think telling the truth was illegal." He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with bolts and engines. These hands, they don't type much, but they know honest work. And what was done to my car, and what's being done to me now, it's not honest. He looked up, and for the first time, he made eye contact with the cameras, not as tools of the media, but as windows into the homes of people like him. I just hope this doesn't happen to anyone else." The simple, unvarnished honesty of his words was more powerful than any political rhetoric. It was the human cost of the legalese. The quiet dignity at the heart of the storm. As Jasmine Crockett gently guided him away from the lectern, the press corps erupted into a chaotic chorus of shouted questions. But the narrative was already set. The battle lines had been drawn not on a legal document, but on the sun-drenched steps of the Capitol, for the entire country to see. As they turned away from the bank of cameras, a protective phalanx of Crockett's young aides materialized, shielding Frank and Mary from the more aggressive reporters trying to shout one last question. The noise was a physical thing, a wave of sound that seemed to press in on Frank from all sides. He felt a hand on his back. It was Crockett. "You did great, Frank. You did perfectly," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the swirling chaos. He could only manage a numb nod. The walk back to her office was a surreal journey through marble hallways that echoed with the brisk footsteps of people with purpose. Frank felt like an imposter, a man in a borrowed suit, walking through a world he was never meant to enter. The moment they stepped back inside the sanctuary of her office, the dam broke. Dara was waiting, her phone pressed to her ear, her eyes wide. She held up a finger, mouthing the words, "It's exploding." The main office phone lines were blinking in a frantic, non-stop rhythm. On a large monitor mounted to the wall, a cable news network had already split its screen into 4 boxes. One with a live shot of the now empty lectern on the Capitol steps, another with a grim-faced host, a third with a picture of Tom Cotton, and a fourth with a looping clip of Crockett's personal vendetta line. The firestorm was immediate and overwhelming. Apex Auto Centers, a company that had spent hundreds of millions of dollars cultivating an image of clean, reliable, family-friendly service, saw its digital reputation get vaporized in under an hour. Its Google rating, once a solid 4.2, plummeted to 1.3 as tens of thousands of people, fueled by the hashtag #StandWithFrank hashtag, left 1-star reviews. many simply posting a link to the press conference. Their social media pages were a digital graveyard. Every corporate post about fall tune-up specials, buried under an avalanche of furious comments and memes depicting their logo as a vulture picking a wallet clean. The movement took on a life of its own. People began using the hashtag to share their own horror stories with the company. Tales of predatory billing, shoddy repairs, and rude managers from Apex locations in a dozen different states. It was no longer just about Frank Miller. It was about everyone who had ever felt cheated by a company too big to hold accountable. The company's first response was a disaster. A hastily released statement from their corporate PR department called Frank Miller's claims unsubstantiated and referred to the press conference as a staged political stunt. The internet greeted this with derision, and the backlash intensified. By mid-afternoon, Apex Forward, the company's political action committee, had taken its website offline. Senator Cotton's office, usually a model of disciplined messaging, was caught flat-footed. Their initial statement, the one calling Frank a disgruntled customer, was now being used as a weapon against them across every news platform. On CNN, a panel of commentators debated the issue with fervor. "This is a masterstroke by Crockett," said a liberal analyst. "She's personalized a complex issue of corporate influence and turned it into a simple, powerful story of a bully and his victim." The conservative panelist countered, his voice tight with frustration. "This is a gross politicization of a private legal dispute." Senator Cotton rightfully defended a business in his state from a baseless attack. Jasmine Crockett is using this poor man as a prop for a national fundraising campaign. Over on MSNBC, the host was practically giddy. "Look at the power of this," she said, gesturing to a graphic showing the nosedive of Apex's stock price, which had already shed 3% of its value. Jasmine Crockett, a former public defender, just gave a multi-billion-dollar corporation and one of the most powerful Republican senators a lesson in what happens when you punch down. Fox News offered a starkly different narrative. The primetime host stared into the camera, his face a mask of indignation. "The radical left has a new tactic," he seethed. "They find a citizen with a grievance, real or imagined, and use them as a human shield to attack conservative leaders." Senator Tom Cotton is a decorated Army veteran and a dedicated public servant. The idea that he would be involved in some conspiracy to silence a mechanic is not just absurd, it's a slander against his character, orchestrated by a progressive extremist who has more interest in getting on TV than in governing. Back in Crockett's office, the atmosphere was electric. Staffers were fielding calls from major news shows, from fellow Democratic lawmakers offering support, and even from law firms offering to represent Frank Miller pro bono. But amidst the triumphant energy, there was a darker current. Dara quietly pulled Crockett aside, away from the celebratory buzz. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice low. She led Crockett to her own desk and turned the monitor around. It was an email, sent to the General Press Inquiry address, but its subject line was simply Crockett's name. The body of the message was a short, chilling block of text, riddled with racial slurs and misogynistic bile. It described, in graphic detail, the violence that should be visited upon her for attacking a patriot like Senator Cotton. It mentioned the color of her skin and her gender as reasons she was unfit for office. It ended with a single, ominous sentence. "We know where you live." Dara had also saved a voicemail that had come into the main line. She played it on speaker, the volume low. The voice was distorted, raspy, and filled with a venom that made the air feel cold. It repeated many of the same slurs from the email, but hearing them spoken gave them a terrifying weight. It called her an uppity witch who needed to be taught a lesson. Frank and Mary, who were sitting on a couch nearby, overheard the voice. Mary gasped and put a hand over her mouth. Frank's face went pale. The victory of the morning suddenly felt hollow, replaced by a raw, chilling fear. This was the other side of the firestorm. For every message of support, there was a message like this. A reminder of the deep, ugly currents that flowed just beneath the surface of the political debate. Crockett listened to the entire voicemail without flinching, her expression hardening into something unreadable. When it was over, she simply said, "Okay, log it. Send it to the Capitol Police. Don't let my mother hear about this." But of course her mother had already heard. Not about the threats, but about the fight. That evening, after Frank and Mary had been settled back in their hotel with a promise of a police detail for the night, Crockett finally sat down in her quiet apartment. The adrenaline of the day had worn off, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her body ached, and her mind was still racing, replaying the press conference, the news clips, the venomous email. Her phone rang. It was her mother, calling from Texas. "Jasmine, I saw you on the news," her mother began, her voice a mixture of pride and worry. "You were wonderful. You stood up for that poor man." "Thanks, Mama," Crockett said, sinking deeper into her couch. "Are you all right? You look tired." "I'm okay. Just a long day." It was their familiar dance, her mother, trying to breach the walls of her public life to see the daughter underneath. Crockett, trying to protect her from the full cost of the battles she chose to fight. "I worry about you, baby," her mother said, her voice softening. "That senator, he plays rough. The people who support him, they can be—" She trailed off, not wanting to give voice to her fears. "I know, Mama, but that's why you have to fight them. You can't let them win by scaring you into silence. That's their whole game." I know. You get that from your father. Stubborn as a mule, both of you. Just be careful, please. For me." "I'm always careful," Crockett lied, thinking of the email sitting in a police evidence log. "I love you, Mama." "I love you too, baby. Now get some sleep." She hung up, and the silence of the apartment felt immense. The private cost of the public fight was not just the threats or the exhaustion. It was the quiet weight of her mother's worry, a burden she had to carry alone. She had won the day's news cycle, but the war was just beginning. The forces she had provoked were powerful, patient, and ruthless. And she, a congresswoman from Texas, had just painted a target on her own back. For Frank and Mary Miller, the experience was profoundly disorienting. Back in their D.C. hotel room, they watched themselves on TV, feeling a complete detachment from the images on the screen. The Frank Miller, being debated by pundits and praised by strangers, felt like a different person. He was a symbol now, a character in a national drama. The real Frank Miller was just a tired man in a hotel room, terrified of what came next. Is this good?" Mary asked, gesturing to a news segment highlighting the thousands of people now boycotting Apex Auto. Frank didn't know how to answer. On the one hand, he was no longer alone. On the other, his quiet life had been shattered. His phone buzzed. It was his next-door neighbor, a retired postal worker named Gary. "Frank, you okay? I'm just calling to let you know. There's a news van parked outside your house. A local channel." Frank's heart sank. He thought of his small garden, his workshop in the garage, the familiar comfort of his front porch. Now it was a spectacle, a destination for the curious. "And Frank," Gary added, his voice dropping, "somebody spray-painted something on your driveway. I called the cops. They're on their way." "What? What did it say?" Frank asked, dreading the answer. "It says liar," Gary said quietly, "and traitor." Frank closed his eyes. The word vendetta came back to him. Senator Cotton's word that hadn't just been a political statement. It had been an instruction, a permission slip for his supporters. Frank had been branded. In his own neighborhood, in his own home. He looked at Mary, whose face was a canvas of fear. The support of strangers online felt a million miles away. The hatred was right there, on his driveway, a stain on the life he had so carefully built. The lawsuit from Apex had threatened his finances. This felt different. This was an attack on his identity, his place in his own community. He was no longer just Frank Miller, the retired mechanic. He was the man on TV, the liar, the traitor. The national battle had come home, and he was standing at ground zero. The next morning, both sides dug in for a protracted war. Apex Auto, on the advice of a high-priced crisis management firm, went silent. They scrubbed their social media and issued a no comment to all press inquiries. The strategy was clear: let the storm blow over. Senator Cotton's office, however, chose the opposite strategy. They went on the offensive. Cotton appeared on a morning news show, projecting an aura of calm, senatorial gravitas. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appear angry. He was the picture of reason under siege. "This is a classic tactic from the far left," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "They manufacture a controversy, amplify it through their allies in the media, and use it to attack conservatives. My record on supporting small businesses and working families in Arkansas is clear. The attempt by this particular congresswoman from Texas to smear my name for political gain is transparent and, frankly, beneath the dignity of her office." He didn't say Frank's name. He didn't say Crockett's name. He abstracted the fight, turning it into a faceless battle of ideologies. He was no longer a man defending a specific donor. He was a conservative statesman, defending principle against the radical left. "The facts are these," he continued. "A company exercised its legal right to protect itself from defamation. That is all that has happened here. Everything else is political theater, orchestrated by those who wish to silence conservative voices." It was a powerful performance. To his supporters, it was a masterful takedown of a manufactured smear. He was reasonable, strong, and above the fray. The hashtag #IsStandWithCotton began to trend, pushed by a coordinated network of conservative influencers and media outlets. The narrative was now a battle of its own, a war of competing hashtags and realities. Jasmine Crockett watched Cotton's performance from her office, a grim smile on her face. "He's good," she admitted to Dara. "He's trying to make it about me versus him, about left versus right. He wants to drag it back onto his home turf." "What's our move?" Dara asked. "We don't let him," Crockett replied, her eyes fixed on the television. "He wants to talk about ideologies. We keep talking about a man's life. He wants to talk about the far left. We talk about a corrupt system. He's playing chess. We're going to keep flipping the board." She knew that the initial shockwave of the press conference would fade. The news cycle had a short memory. To win, she couldn't just have a better argument. She needed more firepower. She had thrown a powerful punch, but the opponent was still on his feet and punching back, hard. The threats were still coming in. Frank Miller was still under siege in his own home. Apex Auto hadn't dropped the lawsuit. The initial victory was emotional, but the strategic situation was a stalemate. She needed to break it. She needed an ally, someone who could cut through the partisan noise and validate the principle of her argument. And she had no idea where she was going to find one. The days following Senator Cotton's television appearance settled into a grinding war of attrition. The news cycle, ravenous and fickle, began to drift towards other stories. The initial explosive energy of the press conference had dissipated, leaving behind the hard reality of the fight. The threats to Crockett's office continued, a low-grade fever of anonymous hate that her staff diligently logged and reported. In Arkansas, the liar spray-painted on Frank Miller's driveway was scrubbed away, but the sentiment lingered. Neighbors who once waved now averted their eyes. The cashier at the local grocery store asked him if it was true he was trying to ruin a good Arkansas company. The weight of the lawsuit was no longer just financial, it was social, pressing in on him, isolating him in the very community that had been his lifelong home. Apex Auto remained silent, their lawyers confident that the storm would pass, leaving Frank exposed and alone, their lawsuit proceeding quietly through the courts. Cotton's strategy was working. He had successfully muddied the waters, casting the entire affair as a partisan squabble that ordinary people would soon tune out. Jasmine Crockett felt the momentum slipping. She knew that in politics, silence equaled death. If the story faded, Frank's cause was lost. Her team brainstormed ideas. A House floor speech? Another round of TV appearances? an online petition, but it all felt like more of the same. More noise in an already deafening environment. Cotton had effectively framed her as a partisan attacker, and anything else she did would simply be filtered through that lens by half the country. "We're stuck in a spin cycle," she told Dara during a late-night strategy session, rubbing her temples. "He's talking about ideology. I'm talking about a person, and in this climate, ideology is a stronger team jersey than a human face." She needed something to break the frame, something that couldn't be dismissed as left versus right. She needed a voice from the other side of the aisle. But she knew no sitting Republican politician would risk the backlash from their base by publicly siding with her against Tom Cotton. The call she needed would not, and could not, come. And then on a quiet Thursday morning, the earthquake struck. Not on cable news, not on social media, but in the staid, respectable opinion section of the Wall Street Journal. The op-ed was titled, "A Conservative Defense of a Negative Review." The author was not a politician or a pundit, but a name that carried immense weight in legal and intellectual conservative circles. Professor Alastair Finch. Finch was a legend at the University of Chicago Law School, a titan of constitutional originalism, and a founding father of the modern conservative legal movement. With his signature bow tie and a deliberate, almost theatrical manner of speaking, he was a regular and respected guest on the very conservative news shows that had been pillorying Crockett. He was, by all accounts, a man who believed Tom Cotton was generally right about most things. His op-ed began not with the current controversy, but with principle. "The bedrock of a free society and a free market is the unencumbered flow of information and opinion," Finch wrote, his prose precise and academic. "An informed citizenry is the only true check on power, whether that power is wielded by the state or by a corporate behemoth. The right to speak one's mind, to praise, to condemn, to critique, is not a privilege granted by the government. It is a natural right the government is forbidden to abridge. This principle extends, most vitally, to the marketplace. The consumer who shares an honest account of their experience, be it good or ill, is participating in the most fundamental act of market regulation." Dara read the first paragraphs aloud in Crockett's office, her voice laced with disbelief. Crockett stood motionless, listening. The piece continued, methodically and mercilessly, to dismantle the legal arguments of a strategic lawsuit against public participation without ever using the acronym. Finch called it legal thuggery dressed in a tuxedo, a tool for the powerful to purchase silence from the less powerful through financial exhaustion. Then, he turned his attention to the case at hand. The lawsuit filed by Apex Auto Centers against Mr. Frank Miller of Arkansas is a textbook example of this corrosive practice. Finch's op-ed continued. By any reasonable legal standard, Mr. Miller's online review constitutes protected opinion, not defamation. To argue otherwise is to claim a corporation has a right to be shielded from the sincere criticism of its customers. Such a right exists nowhere in our Constitution or our traditions. It is an invention of arrogant corporate boardrooms and their overly ambitious lawyers. And then came the final, devastating paragraphs. It is therefore deeply disheartening to see a conservative leader of Senator Tom Cotton's stature lend his voice to the defense of this practice. To characterize Mr. Miller's speech as a vendetta and the corporation's lawsuit as a legitimate defense of its brand is to turn conservative principles on their head. Conservatism is not, and has never been, about defending corporate power at the expense of individual liberty. It is about defending the Frank Millers of the world from overweening power wherever it may arise. A government big enough to silence its critics is a tyranny. A corporation powerful enough to do the same is little better. The Congresswoman from Texas and I would likely disagree on 99 out of 100 political issues. But on the fundamental right of a man to speak his mind without fear of financial ruin, there can be no disagreement. The lawsuit against Mr. Miller should be dropped, and conservatives should be the loudest voices demanding it. The op-ed landed like a tactical nuke in the center of the political landscape. It was an intellectual, principled, and utterly unassailable argument from a source that Tom Cotton's allies could not ignore or easily discredit. Alastair Finch was not a radical leftist. He was one of them. The effect was immediate. The conversation shifted from Crockett versus Cotton to a serious national debate about SLAPP suits and free speech. The same Fox News host who had called Crockett an extremist 2 days earlier was now forced to lead his show with the op-ed. He had Professor Finch on as a guest, and the elderly scholar, in his calm, professorial tone, refused to be drawn into the partisan fray. "This is not a political issue. It is a constitutional one," Finch stated, peering over his spectacles. "I am not defending the Congresswoman's politics, which I largely abhor. I am defending the Constitution, which I cherish. And the lawsuit against this mechanic is an offense to it." The dam of Republican silence broke. A handful of moderate senators, when cornered by reporters in the Capitol hallways, began to hedge. "I have a great deal of respect for Professor Finch," one offered. "I believe he has raised some very important questions about corporate litigation that we ought to examine." Another said, "Of course I support Senator Cotton, but we must always be vigilant in protecting the First Amendment rights of all citizens." The statements were weak, non-committal, but they were a world away from the unified wall of silence that had existed just 24 hours earlier. Cotton was being isolated, not by his enemies, but by his own side's core principles. For Frank Miller, reading the op-ed on his laptop in his kitchen was a moment of profound vindication. Mary read it over his shoulder, her hand gripping his. Here was a man they had never met, a brilliant scholar from a world away, who understood their plight perfectly. He hadn't just defended Frank's actions, he had given them dignity. He had called Frank a participant in the most fundamental act of market regulation. He wasn't a liar or a traitor. He was a citizen performing his duty. That afternoon, as Frank was mowing his lawn, his neighbor Gary, the retired postal worker, walked over. "Hey Frank," he said, "I read that article in the Journal." The professor guy. He was right. What they're doing to you is dead wrong. He clapped Frank on the shoulder. "Don't let him get you down!" It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. The brand of traitor was beginning to wash away, replaced by the simple, powerful idea that he had a right to tell his story. The intellectual support from a Chicago professor had translated into a restored friendship on a quiet street in Little Rock. In D.C., Jasmine Crockett saw her opening. The ground had shifted beneath her feet, opened up by the most unlikely of allies. Professor Finch had provided the air cover she needed. He had depoliticized the principle, leaving the political and personal actions of the players exposed. Now, she could deliver the final, defining statement of the conflict on her own terms. "He built us a bridge across the partisan divide," she told her team, who were buzzing with a renewed sense of purpose. "Now we're going to march right across it." She knew exactly what she had to do. It wouldn't be a press conference or a TV hit. It needed to be a moment of record, something more lasting than a news cycle. "Get me a slot for a 1 minute on the House floor for tomorrow morning," she instructed Dara. "And get me the legal department for Apex Auto on the phone. It's time to have a direct conversation." She felt a surge of energy, the exhaustion of the past week burning away. The board had been flipped, just as she'd wanted. Now, it was her move. Her first call was not to Apex, however. It was to Professor Alastair Finch. His assistant was hesitant to put her through, but Crockett insisted. When the professor's gravelly voice came on the line, she kept it brief and direct. "Professor Finch, my name is Jasmine Crockett." "I know who you are, Congresswoman," he replied, his tone dry and devoid of warmth. "I just wanted to thank you," Crockett said. "Your op-ed was principled and powerful. You didn't have to write it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I did not write it for you, Congresswoman," Finch said coolly. "I wrote it for the Constitution, and for a mechanic in Arkansas who is being bullied. We are not allies. On this one issue, our interests simply converged." "I understand that," Crockett said, a small smile playing on her lips. "But thank you anyway. You gave a good man his dignity back." She hung up before he could reply. They were not allies. But for one crucial moment, they were on the same side. And that was all that mattered. The stage was now set for the climax. Apex Auto was reeling, Tom Cotton was isolated, and Jasmine Crockett was about to make her final move. The air in Jasmine Crockett's office was still. The usual hum of activity had ceased, the staffers standing by their desks, silent, all eyes on their boss. Crockett sat behind her desk, the phone on speaker. Beside her, Dara held a notepad, her pen poised. After a series of transfers through a corporate phone tree designed to repel all human contact, a man's voice, crisp and wary, finally came on the line. "This is Daniel Shapiro, General Counsel for Apex Auto Centers." "To whom am I speaking?" "Mr. Shapiro," Crockett began, her own voice calm and level, devoid of the righteous fire she displayed in public. This was not a performance. This was business. "This is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. I'm calling to discuss the frivolous and malicious lawsuit your company has filed against my constituent. And for the purposes of this conversation, that's what he is. Mr. Frank Miller." There was a stiff silence on the other end. "Congresswoman, it is our policy not to comment on pending litigation," Shapiro said, the standard corporate shield. "Not asking for a comment, Daniel," Crockett replied, using his first name with deliberate familiarity. "I'm providing you with some information so you and your board can make an informed decision. As of this morning, your company's stock is down nearly 7% since Monday. Your brand's public sentiment score, according to the metrics I'm looking at, has fallen by 92%. There are currently, by my staff's count, 3 nationwide boycott campaigns being organized against you on social media. And that's all before Professor Alastair Finch, a man I'm sure your board members deeply respect, publicly dismantled your entire legal strategy as thuggery in the country's leading business journal. That was yesterday. Today will be worse." "What is the purpose of this call, Congresswoman?" Shapiro's voice was tight, the corporate poise cracking. "The purpose is to inform you of what comes next," Crockett said, her tone hardening just enough to convey absolute resolve. "In 2 weeks, I will be holding hearings in the House Oversight Committee on the systemic abuse of the American legal system by corporations to silence consumer speech. Your CEO, Mr. Evans, will be the first person I subpoena. He will sit under oath and attempt to justify to the American people why his company felt it was appropriate to try and bankrupt a retired mechanic for exercising his First Amendment rights. I want you to picture that scene for a moment, Daniel. Your CEO on every news channel squirming." She let that image hang in the air before continuing. "After that hearing, I will be introducing new federal legislation to create a uniform standard for anti-SLAPP protections nationwide. It will include provisions for punitive damages against any corporation found to be engaging in such practices. And I'm going to call it the Frank Miller Act. Your brand will be permanently and legally associated with corporate bullying for as long as the law exists." Another silence, this one longer, heavier. Crockett's staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. This was a raw exercise of power they had only ever read about. "You have until 5 o'clock today, Eastern Time, to do the right thing," Crockett concluded, her voice now a clinical, cold instrument. "That means dropping the lawsuit against Mr. Miller with prejudice, issuing a public apology to him and his family, and covering all his legal fees to date, nominal as they may be. If I do not have a public statement from your company confirming these actions by 5 p.m., I will consider it a refusal, and I will proceed on all fronts. Have a good day, Daniel." She disconnected the call, plunging the office back into silence. Dara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "My God," she whispered. Crockett leaned back in her chair, the mask of the warrior dissolving for just a second, revealing the tired woman beneath. "Now," she said, her voice returning to normal, "let's go write a speech." An hour later, she stood on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. The chamber was mostly empty, as it often was for the morning's 1-minute speeches. But Crockett wasn't speaking to the room. She was speaking to the C-SPAN cameras, to the network feeds, to the nation. "Mr. Speaker," she began, "I rise today not to speak of division, but of a unifying principle, a principle that, for a moment this week, bridged the chasm between left and right. That principle is the freedom of speech, not just the grand, abstract freedom we debate in the halls of justice, but the small, essential freedom of an ordinary citizen to speak their mind without fear. A man from Arkansas, a retired auto mechanic named Frank Miller, did just that. He had a bad experience with a large corporation, and he wrote a 142-word review to warn his neighbors. In response, that corporation, Apex Auto Centers, brought the full weight of its billion-dollar legal team down upon him, seeking to ruin him financially for the crime of having an opinion. This story struck a chord, because every American understands what it feels like to be the little guy. But something remarkable happened. A renowned conservative legal scholar, Professor Alastair Finch, wrote a powerful defense of Mr. Miller, not from a place of politics, but from a place of principle. He argued that conservatism is about protecting individual liberty from powerful entities, whether it's big government or big business. And he is absolutely right. This should not be a partisan issue. The right to tell the truth is not a Democratic or a Republican value. It is an American value. That is why today, I am announcing my intention to introduce new, bipartisan legislation, which I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will join me in crafting, called the Frank Miller Act. It will protect American consumers from strategic, bankrupting lawsuits designed to silence them. It will ensure that the courthouse is a place for justice, not a playground for corporate bullies. Let this be a message to any company that thinks it can buy the silence of the American people. You cannot. Our voices are not for sale. Our rights are not negotiable. I yield back. She turned from the podium. The clip was already being cut, packaged, and pushed out onto the internet. It was 3:45 p.m. In his opulent office in the Russell Senate office building, Tom Cotton watched the speech on a monitor, his face a granite mask of fury. The clip of Crockett's speech was already playing on a loop on cable news, juxtaposed with a picture of a beaming Frank Miller. His chief of staff stood nearby, looking helpless. "Sir, the phones," he started to say, but Cotton waved him into silence. The senator, a man used to controlling every variable, had been completely outmaneuvered. Crockett hadn't attacked him. She had praised his side's core principles and co-opted them. She had made herself the champion of a conservative ideal, leaving him looking like a paid corporate stooge who had betrayed it. His phone buzzed. It was the CEO of Apex Auto. Cotton ignored the call. He knew what the man would say, a stream of panicked accusations, blaming him for the disaster. He had made a fatal error. He had underestimated Jasmine Crockett, assuming she was just another loud-mouthed progressive. He never imagined she could, or would, fight him on his own intellectual turf. He had seen Frank Miller as a nuisance, and Crockett as a partisan. He failed to see that they were a symbol and a strategist, and that combination had just cost him dearly. At 4:52 p.m., 8 minutes before the deadline, an email with a press release attached arrived in Dara's inbox. She opened it, read it, and a wide grin spread across her face. She looked up at Crockett. "They caved," she said, her voice filled with triumph. "All of it. Dropping the suit. Public apology. Covering fees. They're reviewing their litigation policies." The entire office erupted in cheers. Staffers hugged and high-fived. It was a clear, unambiguous victory. Crockett picked up her personal cell phone and walked into the privacy of her inner office. She found Frank Miller's number and dialed. He picked up on the second ring. "Frank, it's Jasmine Crockett." "Congresswoman," he said, his voice tense. "We saw your speech. It was something else." "I have some news for you, Frank," she said, a genuine warmth in her voice. "Apex is dropping the lawsuit. It's over." The other end of the line was silent for a long moment. Crockett could hear a shaky breath. Then the sound of Frank speaking, his voice thick with emotion, to his wife. "Mary, they're dropping it." Mary could be heard bursting into tears in the background. Frank came back on the line, his own voice choked. "Congresswoman, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you for believing me." "You did the brave thing, Frank," she said softly. "You stood up. All I did was make sure the whole country was there to see it. You get some rest now. You've earned it." She ended the call, the feeling of victory finally settling in. It was a win not just for Frank, but for a principle. Miles away, in a small town in Ohio, a 32-year-old woman named Sarah Petrov was scrolling through her phone while her young son slept in the next room. Sarah ran a small catering business from her home, specializing in unique pastries. For the past 6 months, she had been locked in a silent struggle. A much larger, well-established event company in her city, run by a man with deep connections on the city council, had effectively stolen her signature creations. After she catered a large charity event, the company, Prestige Events, suddenly began offering nearly identical pastries, right down to her unique cardamom and rosewater croissant. They undercut her prices and used their market power to squeeze her out of contention for local festivals. Sarah had consulted a lawyer who told her she had a case for trade dress infringement, but that suing would be incredibly expensive and risky. The owner of Prestige had a reputation for litigation. When she posted a carefully worded comment on a local food blog about the similarities in their products, she received a cease and desist letter from Prestige's lawyer the next day, threatening a defamation suit if she ever made such an insinuation again. Terrified, she had remained silent ever since, watching her business slowly bleed out. That night, she saw the clip of Jasmine Crockett's speech. She saw the news alert that Apex Auto had dropped its lawsuit. She read the story of Frank Miller, a man who had faced down a giant corporation over a simple review. She saw the photo of him, looking tired but relieved, standing beside the fiery congresswoman. Something inside her shifted. The fear that had kept her paralyzed for months began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning anger. She looked at her own hands, dusted with flour from a long day of baking for a dwindling list of clients. Her work was honest. Her creations were her own. The silence was killing her. She opened her laptop and went to her business's social media page. Her fingers trembled as she began to type. "My name is Sarah Petrov," she wrote, "and I need to tell you a story about my croissants." Sarah Petrov's post was a simple, direct narrative. It detailed the timeline of her small business, the pride she took in her original recipes, and the specific events that led to the larger company, Prestige Events, suddenly offering identical products. She didn't use inflammatory language or call the owner a thief. She just laid out the facts, attached side-by-side photos of her croissants and their copies, and shared screenshots of the threatening legal letter she had received. She ended it with a line that echoed the national conversation. "I always believed that in business you competed with a better product, not by silencing your competition. I'm a small business owner, not a legal expert, but I'm not afraid to tell the truth anymore." She hit post and went to check on her sleeping son, her heart hammering against her ribs. By the next morning, her post had been shared over 1,000 times within her community. The local food blog that had once removed her comment now featured her story on its front page. Customers flocked to her small shop, some buying dozens of pastries, others just stopping by to offer a word of encouragement. Her sales for the day surpassed any she had ever had, but the victory was short-lived. The owner of Prestige Events, a man named Bill Corrigan who sat on the board of the local Chamber of Commerce, began his counterattack. A friendly columnist in the town's only newspaper wrote a piece lamenting the rise of trial by social media, cautioning readers to be wary of one-sided stories from inexperienced business owners seeking attention. Corrigan himself went on a local radio show and portrayed himself as the victim of a smear campaign, vaguely threatening to take all necessary legal action to protect the reputation of his family business. The threat was clear. Friends began calling Sarah, worried. Her landlord, who rented her the small storefront, called to nervously ask if she was sure this was a good idea. The fear, which had momentarily receded, came rushing back in. The wave of support felt fragile against the entrenched power of a man like Corrigan. It was during that moment of doubt, as she sat alone in her quiet shop after a long day, that an email landed in her inbox. The subject line was, "Your story," and the sender was an organization she'd never heard of, the Miller Initiative. Her first thought was that it was spam, but she opened it anyway. "Dear Miss Petrov," the email began, "we read the story about your catering business in an Ohio news aggregator. Our organization, the Miller Initiative, was recently formed to provide pro bono legal support to small business owners and consumers who are being silenced by corporate intimidation. Your situation is precisely why we were created. The founder of our initiative, an Arkansas mechanic named Frank Miller, asked us to reach out to you personally. We would be honored to represent you, free of charge, in any potential legal action brought by Prestige Events. You do not have to fight this alone. Sarah stared at the words, reading them over and over. Frank Miller. She remembered his face, standing awkwardly but resolutely next to Congresswoman Crockett on the Capitol steps. His fight had created this. It wasn't just a fleeting headline. It was now a tangible thing, a shield she could use. A few days later, after a long call with a sharp, energetic lawyer from the initiative, a new letter was sent to Bill Corrigan. It was not a cease and desist, but a duty to preserve evidence notice, informing him that in the event of any retaliatory action against Ms. Petrov, they were prepared to file a countersuit citing Ohio's anti-SLAPP statutes and would be seeking discovery of all internal communications related to her business and recipes. The tone was professional, polite, and backed by the implicit threat of a long, expensive, and public legal battle that Corrigan had no guarantee of winning. Faced with a fight against lawyers instead of a scared baker, Corrigan's blustering fell silent. His company quietly removed the offending pastries from their menu. There was no apology, but the silence was victory enough. A week later, Sarah's phone rang. It was an Arkansas number. "Is this Sarah?" a man's voice asked, gentle and slightly hesitant. "This is Frank Miller." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Miller," she said, "Your initiative. They saved my business." "Well, I'm glad to hear it," he said, and she could hear a smile in his voice. "The lawyer folks do all the work. I just tell them to look for people who are getting a raw deal. I saw your story. Those croissants looked real nice. It reminded me of what the Congresswoman said, about how we gotta speak up. It ain't easy, is it?" "No, sir," Sarah said, emotion welling up in her. "It's the scariest thing I've ever done." "I know the feeling," Frank said, "but you did it. That's the thing. You did it. So I just wanted to call and say, congratulations. Keep up the good work." They talked for a few more minutes. Two strangers from different states, bound by a shared experience of fear and defiance. Frank was no longer just a victim who had been saved. He was now a source of strength, his quiet voice a reassurance that they were not alone. His identity was no longer the man who was sued, but the man who fought back and now helped others do the same. In Washington, D.C., a month after the press conference that started it all, life had found a new, post-crisis normal. The Frank Miller Act was slowly making its way through the legislative process, co-sponsored by a surprising number of Republicans who, thanks to Professor Finch's intervention, could frame their support as a defense of conservative free market principles. The media had moved on. Tom Cotton was keeping a lower public profile, his name now inextricably linked to a story where he had been cast as the villain. Apex Auto was running a massive ad campaign focused on listening to our customers, their brand forever scarred but struggling to heal. Jasmine Crockett was in her office, deep into a briefing on a transportation bill, when Dara walked in and placed a tablet on her desk. "I thought you might want to see this," she said. On the screen was a local news segment from a station in Ohio. It was the story of Sarah Petrov, the small-town caterer who had stood up to a local business bully. The story detailed her fight and her victory, and it prominently mentioned the legal help she had received from a new group called the Miller Initiative. The reporter explained the group's origin, linking it directly back to Crockett's defense of the Arkansas mechanic. Crockett watched the whole segment, a slow smile spreading across her face. She saw Sarah, confident and happy, standing in her bustling shop. She heard the name Frank Miller spoken with reverence. This was the lasting echo. It wasn't the fawning cable news profiles of her, or the hateful voicemails from her detractors. It wasn't the political points scored, or the dip in an opponent's poll numbers. It was this, a woman she would never meet, in a town she had never visited, whose life was measurably better because of a fight she had chosen to pick. The real victory wasn't loud. It was the quiet ripple of courage spreading out into the world, touching shores she would never see. The win wasn't just dropping a lawsuit, it was building a safety net. She pushed the tablet back across the desk to Dara. "Okay," she said, her voice all business again. "Tell me about these highway appropriations." The fight continued, as it always would. But today, she knew she had won. What does it truly mean for a politician to win? Is it passing a law, or is it changing a life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that go beyond the headlines.